What did a German immigrant understand about heat storage that American brick masons had forgotten? Missouri Ozarks, 1872. While his neighbors mortared brick and stone into walls they believed represented progress and civilization, one settler mixed mud, straw, and clay with his bare hands. They called it backward. They called it primitive. They predicted it would melt with the first rain and crumble with the first frost. They were wrong. This is the story of how ancient building wisdom outperformed modern materials when winter became a matter of survival. If you value forgotten knowledge that still works today, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us what traditional building technique you trust your life to. Christian Bauer arrived in Stone County, Missouri, in March of 1872 with his wife, 2 children, and a building method his neighbors had never seen. While other settlers were ordering kiln-fired brick from St. Louis at considerable expense, or quarrying limestone from nearby outcrops, Bauer walked his property, digging his fingers into the clay-rich soil, nodding to himself, speaking in German to his eldest son. "He's planning to build with dirt," remarked Samuel Bradley, a local brick mason who'd constructed 4 cabins that year alone. Dirt and grass like some kind of savage. But Bauer wasn't planning to build with just any dirt. He was preparing to construct using a technique his grandfather had perfected in Württemberg, a method the Germans called Lehmbau, a form of cob construction that had kept families warm through alpine winters for centuries. The fundamental principle was simple but precise. Clay-rich subsoil mixed with straw in specific ratios formed into monolithic walls that would be neither stacked like brick nor poured like concrete, but sculpted, layer by layer, into thermal masses that could store and release heat for hours after a fire died. Bradley watched with a mixture of amusement and pity as Bauer excavated clay from a depth of 3 feet below the topsoil, testing its plasticity by rolling it between his palms. "That wall won't last 1 season," Bradley told the gathering of settlers who'd come to observe this curiosity. "First hard rain will wash it down to nothing. Brick is modern. Brick is proven." That, he gestured toward Bauer's pile of raw earth. That's what people built before they knew better. What Bradley couldn't see, what none of them could see, was that Bauer was performing empirical materials testing that predated the American colonies by millennia. He was checking clay content, fiber length, moisture ratios. He rejected the first 2 excavation sites because the clay was too sandy. He insisted on long-stem prairie grass, not the short meadow growth, because fiber length affected structural integrity and insulation properties. By late April, Bauer had mixed his first batch, roughly 70% clay-rich subsoil, 30% chopped straw, with just enough water to achieve a thick, sculptable consistency. He didn't measure with instruments. He measured with his hands, his eyes, his experience. The mix had to hold its shape when formed into a ball and dropped from shoulder height. Too wet and it would slump. Too dry and it wouldn't bind. The walls rose slowly. Bauer built them 22 inches thick at the base, tapering slightly to 18 inches at the roofline. He worked in layers, allowing each to firm slightly before adding the next, sculpting the surface smooth with his hands and wooden floats. He embedded stones at strategic points for structural reinforcement, creating a hybrid mass that combined the thermal storage of stone with the insulating properties of clay and straw. "It looks like a melting candle," one neighbor observed. "It looks like desperation," said another. Bradley came by twice that first month, shaking his head each time. "You're wasting your summer, Bauer. When that wall cracks and fails, you'll have to start over with real materials. I can sell you brick at a fair price." But Bauer didn't need brick. What he needed was thermal mass, the ability of a material to absorb heat slowly and release it slowly. Brick had some thermal mass, certainly, but brick walls in Missouri cabins were typically only 8 to 12 inches thick, and they were often laid with air gaps and lime mortar that reduced their thermal storage capacity. Bauer's monolithic earthen walls, more than 18 inches thick throughout, represented roughly 4,000 pounds of dense, clay-heavy material per linear foot of wall, nearly 3 times the thermal mass of the brick cabins his neighbors were so proud of. The fundamental misunderstanding between Bauer and his critics came down to a confusion between 2 different thermal properties, thermal resistance and thermal mass. Thermal resistance, what modern engineers call R-value, measures how well a material resists heat flow. This is what Bradley and the other brick builders thought they understood. Brick, they reasoned, was dense and solid, therefore it kept heat inside. But that reasoning was incomplete. Thermal mass measures something entirely different: the capacity of a material to store heat energy. A material with high thermal mass absorbs heat when the surrounding air is warm, then slowly releases that heat when the air cools. The effect is stabilization. Thermal mass doesn't prevent heat loss so much as it delays and moderates it, creating a buffer against rapid temperature swings. Bauer's earthen walls combined both properties in ways brick couldn't match. The clay provided thermal mass, massive heat storage capacity. The straw fibers, distributed throughout the matrix like millions of tiny insulating chambers, provided thermal resistance, slowing the rate at which heat could escape. Together, they created a wall that could absorb heat from a modest fire during the evening, then radiate that stored warmth back into the living space for 12 to 14 hours after the flames died. The specific heat capacity of clay-rich soil is approximately 0.2 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. With roughly 4,000 pounds of material per linear foot of wall, and walls totaling about 60 linear feet in Bauer's 18 by 20-foot cabin, the total thermal mass was extraordinary. Those walls could store over 48,000 BTU per degree of temperature rise, enough to maintain livable interior temperatures through a cold night using far less wood than conventional construction required. Bradley's brick cabins, by contrast, had walls averaging 8 inches thick with a total mass perhaps 40% of Bauer's earthen structure. More critically, the brick was laid with lime mortar joints that created thermal breaks, gaps in the thermal mass that reduced overall heat storage. And brick's specific heat capacity, while respectable, was lower than the clay-rich earthen mix Bauer used. The numbers told a story Bradley couldn't see because he'd never bothered to calculate them. But Bauer knew them instinctively, passed down through generations of German builders who'd refined these ratios through centuries of alpine winters. There was another factor, subtler but equally important: radiant heat versus convective heat. Brick walls heated up quickly and created convective currents, moving air that felt warm near the fire but left cold zones in corners and near the floor. Earthen walls heated more slowly, but radiated heat more evenly, creating a gentler, more uniform warmth that penetrated into the living space rather than rising immediately to the ceiling and escaping through roof gaps. If you're learning something valuable about how traditional builders understood thermodynamics before we had modern HVAC systems, show your support. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and comment below with the traditional building technique from your region that you'd most want to learn. By October 1872, Bauer's cabin was complete. The earthen walls had dried through the summer, hardening into a solid, monolithic structure. He'd coated the exterior with a lime wash for weather protection, a thin, breathable layer that would shed rain without trapping moisture inside the wall mass. The interior he left exposed, knowing that the raw earthen surface would radiate heat more effectively than any plaster coating. Bradley came by for a final inspection in November. "I'll admit it's still standing," he said, running his hand along the smooth interior wall. "But wait until January. That's when you'll see the difference between real building materials and this." Bauer simply nodded. He'd heard the same predictions from his grandfather's critics in Germany, and he'd seen those critics eventually building with Lehm themselves after the first hard winter proved what mathematics and experience already knew. The winter of 1872 to 1873 began mildly, with temperatures hovering in the 30s and 40s through December. Bradley took this as confirmation of his predictions. "If this is the worst winter throws at us," he told neighbors at the general store, "Bauer's mud hut might make it through after all. But mark my words, a real cold snap will show what that wall is made of." January 11th, 1873, brought what Bradley had been waiting for. An Arctic front swept down from Canada, dropping temperatures across Missouri with brutal speed. By evening, Thermometers outside the cabins read 8 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 13 degrees Celsius. By midnight, they'd fallen to minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 20 degrees Celsius. By dawn on January 12th, the mercury had bottomed out at minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 24 degrees Celsius, the coldest temperature Stone County had recorded in a decade. It was the kind of cold that killed livestock, froze water barrels solid, and turned cabin life into a desperate mathematics of wood consumption versus heat retention. Every settler in the region faced the same equation. Burn enough wood to stay alive, but not so much that you ran out before spring. A miscalculation could be fatal. Bradley's cabin, like most brick structures in the area, had a standard fireplace configuration, a firebox approximately 24 inches deep and 36 inches wide, built from the same kiln-fired brick as his walls. He'd built it himself and considered it fine craftsmanship, proper draft, clean burning, efficient. That night, he kept the fire burning steadily, feeding it split oak every 45 minutes to maintain interior temperatures. Christian Bauer's approach was different. His fireplace was smaller, 20 inches deep, 30 inches wide, but built directly into one of the earthen walls rather than as a separate brick structure. The firebox sat low, almost at floor level, and a thick earthen mass surrounded it on 3 sides, absorbing heat directly from the flames and the hot stone lining the combustion chamber. Bauer built his fire at dusk and tended it carefully until about 10 p.m. Then, as was his practice, he let it burn down to coals, added one final split of hardwood, and went to bed. The fire would die completely within 2 hours, something that would have been unthinkable in a brick cabin during weather this severe. Bradley, meanwhile, kept his fire roaring. At midnight, he woke to add wood. At 2 a.m., again. At 4 a.m., again. Each time, he noted with satisfaction that his cabin remained tolerably warm. Not comfortable, but survivable. The thermometer inside his cabin read 54 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius at midnight, 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius at 2 a.m., 49 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 degrees Celsius at 4 a.m. The slow decline required constant vigilance and constant fuel. In Bauer's cabin, something different was happening. The massive earthen walls, heated throughout the evening by the fire, had absorbed enormous quantities of thermal energy. Now, even as the fire died to ash, those walls were releasing that stored heat back into the interior space. The temperature dropped more slowly, 59 degrees Fahrenheit at midnight, 57 degrees Fahrenheit at 2 a.m., 55 degrees Fahrenheit at 4 a.m., and Bauer slept through the night undisturbed, his family warm under wool blankets, no fire tending required. By dawn on January 12th, both men emerged to feed livestock and assess the damage. The cold had been extraordinary, tree sap frozen solid, metal tools brittle, breath freezing before it dispersed. Bradley's first task was to split more firewood. He'd burned through nearly an entire day's supply in a single night. Bauer spent the morning checking his animals, then returned to a cabin that still registered 53 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius inside, more than 65 degrees warmer than the outside air, with no active fire for 7 hours. The word spread quickly. By mid-morning, neighbors began stopping by, curious about the Germans' mud hut that supposedly stayed warm without burning wood all night. Bradley came by around noon, thermometer in hand, skeptical but intrigued. What happened over the next week in Stone County, Missouri, became a practical demonstration in thermal physics that no amount of theoretical explanation could have achieved. Samuel Bradley, to his credit, didn't simply dismiss what he was seeing. Instead, he proposed a systematic comparison. He would track, hour by hour, the interior temperature of his brick cabin and Bauer's earthen cabin under identical conditions. He would measure wood consumption. He would document fire management practices. If Bauer's design truly performed better, Bradley wanted to understand why. The testing protocol was simple but rigorous. Both cabins were approximately the same interior dimensions. Bradley's was 16 by 22 feet, Bauer's 18 by 20. Both had similar window configurations, similar door construction, similar roof insulation using straw and sod. The primary variable was wall construction. Bradley's 8-inch brick versus Bauer's 20-inch earthen cob. Both men agreed to build fires from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. each evening, using split oak from the same woodlot. After 10 p.m., fires would be allowed to die completely, no overnight tending. Temperature readings would be taken at midnight, 3 a.m., 6 a.m., and 9 a.m. The results were stark. On the first night of testing, January 13th, with outside temperatures at 6 degrees Fahrenheit minus 14 degrees Celsius, both cabins reached approximately 68 degrees Fahrenheit 20 degrees Celsius by 10 p.m. By midnight, Bradley's brick cabin had dropped to 56 degrees Fahrenheit 13 degrees Celsius. Bauer's earthen cabin measured 64 degrees Fahrenheit 18 degrees Celsius, 8 degrees warmer. By 3 a.m., the gap had widened. Bradley's cabin at 47 degrees Fahrenheit 8 degrees Celsius. Bauer's at 58 degrees Fahrenheit 14 degrees Celsius. By 6 a.m., Bradley at 41 degrees Fahrenheit 5 degrees Celsius. Bauer at 54 degrees Fahrenheit 12 degrees Celsius. But the more revealing metric was wood consumption. To maintain that 68 degrees Fahrenheit peak temperature by 10 p.m., Bradley had burned approximately 45 pounds of split oak. Bauer had burned 28 pounds, nearly 40% less, to achieve the same initial temperature. And Bauer's cabin retained heat so much more effectively that his family woke to comfortable temperatures, while Bradley's family woke to near-freezing conditions requiring an immediate new fire. The difference wasn't marginal. It was transformational. Bradley ran the numbers carefully. Over the course of a typical Missouri winter, roughly 120 days of cold weather requiring heating, his brick cabin would consume approximately 5,400 pounds of firewood. Bauer's earthen cabin would use roughly 3,360 pounds for equivalent comfort. That was a savings of 2,040 pounds of wood, more than a full cord, representing dozens of hours of labor saved in cutting, splitting, and hauling. But the numbers told only part of the story. The quality of warmth differed fundamentally. Bradley's brick walls created a cabin that was either hot near the fire or cold in the corners. Temperature differentials of 15 to 20 degrees between the area immediately around the fireplace and the far corners of the room. Bauer's earthen walls radiated heat more evenly, creating a gentler, more uniform warmth. The temperature differential in his cabin rarely exceeded 8 degrees, and the radiant heat from the walls felt more penetrating, more comfortable than the convective heat from Bradley's fireplace. There was one more surprise. As the week of testing continued and outside temperatures moderated slightly, rising to the mid-20s, Bauer's cabin required even less active heating. The massive thermal mass of the walls had stabilized, creating a thermal buffer that required only modest evening fires to maintain comfort. On January 17th, with outside temperatures at 28 degrees Fahrenheit minus 2 degrees Celsius, Bauer burned just 18 pounds of wood, and his cabin never dropped below 58 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. Bradley had built 4 cabins that year. He'd been paid well for his work. He'd been proud of his craftsmanship. Now he stood in Bauer's earthen cabin at dawn. No fire burning, the interior still warm enough to be comfortable in shirt sleeves, and understood that his modern brick construction had been outperformed by a building method he dismissed as primitive. If this story of traditional wisdom outperforming modern assumptions is resonating with you, help us share this knowledge. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below telling us what traditional technique you've seen dismissed that actually works better than modern alternatives. By late January, 3 other settlers had approached Bauer asking him to teach them his building method. Bradley was one of them. Spring 1873 brought a transformation to Stone County that went far beyond individual cabins. Samuel Bradley began his earthen structure in April, working alongside Christian Bauer to learn the proper clay-to-straw ratios, the correct consistency, the rhythm of building in layers. He'd spent the winter doing something rare for a skilled tradesman, admitting he'd been wrong and studying a technique he dismissed. His new cabin, completed by August, incorporated 24-inch earthen walls and a low firebox design integrated directly into the thermal mass. By the following winter, His wood consumption had dropped by 43% compared to his brick cabin, and his family slept through cold nights undisturbed. Thomas and William Grierson, brothers who'd settled adjacent parcels, built matching earthen cabins that summer. So did Margaret Hendricks, a widow who'd been struggling to cut enough firewood to heat her brick dwelling alone. She'd been spending 4 hours a day on wood preparation during winter months. Bauer's design cut her labor nearly in half, not just with savings, but time savings that allowed her to focus on other survival necessities. By the autumn of 1874, the technique had spread beyond Stone County. A traveling minister carried news of the Germans' warm houses north to Polk County, where 2 families built earthen cabins before winter. A mill operator in Greene County heard the story and constructed an earthen building for his family's dwelling. Within 2 years of that January cold snap, at least 12 earthen cob structures had been built within a 30-mile radius of Bauer's original cabin, each one a testament to thermal principles that predated the United States by millennia. The architectural shift wasn't just practical, it was philosophical. Settlers who'd equated modern with better and traditional with primitive had to recalibrate their assumptions. Brick, quarried stone, kiln-fired materials. These weren't inherently superior to earth-based construction. They simply represented different thermal strategies, and in this climate, with these resources, the ancient method performed demonstrably better. Christian Bauer's original cabin stood for 47 years. When it was finally torn down in 1919 to make way for a larger farmhouse, the earthen walls were still solid, still structurally sound, showing none of the deterioration critics had predicted. The lime-washed exterior had protected the earthen core from weather. The interior walls, worn smooth by decades of use, had maintained their thermal performance year after year. Samuel Bradley, who'd mocked those walls in 1872, built 3 more earthen structures in his career and taught the technique to his sons. Before he died in 1891, he wrote in a letter to his brother in Illinois, "I spent the first part of my life believing that progress meant abandoning old ways. I spent the second part learning that old ways often embedded wisdom we'd forgotten how to see." Bauer's mud walls taught me that dismissing traditional knowledge as backward often revealed not their ignorance, but ours. The lesson wasn't just about building materials. It was about epistemology, how we know what we know, and how easily we confuse novelty with improvement. The settlers who'd arrived in Missouri brought assumptions about what civilized construction looked like, assumptions shaped by Eastern cities and European brick traditions. But those assumptions didn't account for frontier resource limitations, local climate conditions, or the accumulated wisdom of building cultures that had solved similar problems centuries earlier in similar conditions. Bauer's contribution wasn't innovation, it was translation. He'd taken a building method refined over centuries in Central Europe and demonstrated its applicability to the Missouri Ozarks. The thermal physics were the same. The materials were locally available. The technique was replicable. What had seemed primitive to his neighbors was actually sophisticated vernacular engineering that had survived because it worked. Today, earthen construction is experiencing a renaissance among builders interested in sustainable, low-embodied energy materials. Modern cob houses, rammed earth structures, and adobe buildings are being constructed across North America, often by people who believe they're discovering something new. They're not. They're rediscovering what Christian Bauer and thousands of traditional builders always knew, that massive earthen walls, properly constructed, create thermal performance that modern materials struggle to match. The story of that January night in 1873, of impossible numbers and impossible warmth, remains a reminder. When someone dismisses a traditional technique as primitive, it's worth asking. Primitive compared to what? Measured by what metrics? Under what conditions? Sometimes the old way isn't the inferior way. Sometimes it's the proven way, waiting for crisis to demonstrate what experience already knew. If this story changed how you think about traditional building wisdom, help us preserve and share this knowledge. Like this video, subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into frontier survival techniques. And tell us in the comments, what traditional knowledge do you think deserves more attention in our modern world? The warmth in those earthen walls wasn't magic. It was physics, materials science, and centuries of accumulated wisdom. Christian Bauer didn't invent anything. He simply remembered what his neighbors had forgotten. That survival on the frontier required humility. The humility to learn from those who'd survived before, regardless of how primitive their methods appeared to modern eyes.